Hello friends, welcome back to the channel and this Sunday's live streaming. In today's stream, I want to share with you some cool and creative ways you can use Ableton Live for sound design so you can level up your skills and begin crafting your own unique sounds. If you've missed my previous video on sound design tips and tricks with Live, I'll pop a link to that video somewhere here. And a quick one before we dive into this week's video adventure. I do want to let you know if you are enjoying the content on the channel, please feel free to like, comment and subscribe. And if you learned something new, let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear about it. So without further ado, let's get started with today's video. Actually, just a very quick one before I do that. I want to just do a shout out or two and a thank you. So I'm just going to move across to a couple of images. The first one in here is from Lauren, and I posted this comment. Hey friends, what is the #1 question you have about Ableton Live? And Lauren responded, sound design in Live, Meld and Raw. And there is a second one. Here it is here. The other shout out I want to do is a big thank you to @bornmusic for this really lovely comment. It's always nice to receive some positive energy and kind words. Your videos are well presented. I hope your channel grows as your knowledge is excellent. So thank you very much, Born for taking the time to leave that comment. So looking at the other comment from Lauren, I'm often reaching out to you guys and girls and asking, what would you like to see here? So always feel free to pop a comment in the stream or below a video suggesting something you might like me to break down in a future video. So Lauren asked about sound design with Live 12, that being the case for Meld and Raw. So we're going to definitely take a look at that today. And I popped in the comments earlier that I'll be taking a closer look at those two devices, but I will also share some tips and tricks that will apply to previous versions of Live, so you won't be left out in the cold on that side of things. All right, so let's pop over to the screen share view, our lovely view of Ableton. Get OBS out of the way here, and here we are looking at today's project window. Chavi Diaz. Buenas tardes, my friends. How are you doing? I hope you're well, and I hope you can hear fine with the microphone. So let's have a quick little test of the music. Perhaps if I can call on you, Chavi, just to let me know if the volumes are okay. So let's play something like a kick that we've got over here. Let's quickly just check there that we've got our settings right. So black hole should be correct there. Okay, interesting. Not actually hearing that. So let's just check something here. Okay. Let's put our signal up a little bit. Let's try something else from here. No sound output on my end, which is interesting. A quick look around and see if there's anything that's kind of causing that. Let's try this, change. No, still the same. Okay, bear with me folks. Seem to have a bit of an audio change here today, which is interesting. Checking everything over here. Let's try again now. No. So I'm guessing at your end, you're probably not hearing anything either, which is interesting. So what we're going to do is just try changing properties here for a second, very quickly. Let's say something like, what are we going to choose here? Let's say spotlight for a second, and then we'll bounce back to live. There we go. Okay. So apologies for that, just somehow lost a little bit of a connection with the audio, but hopefully now we're back in business. It is my end, so fingers crossed it's back in business at your end as well. So sorry for that little interruption. But now we can kind of, again, I'll just run a quick test with some other things here. And as I said, if you're still there, Chavi, if you can let me know that you are hearing that now, that would be fantastic. Just run it on for a second. Right, that's the kind of thing that happens in live streams sometimes. As I said, don't know what changed, but we lost the audio for a moment, but everything else seems to be healthy and fine. I think my webcam and microphone are all good. Thanks, Chavi, and thanks for hanging in there while we had a loss of audio for a moment. All right, so let's maybe start with taking a look at the device that is known as Meld in Live 12. Meld is a brand new synthesizer, a brand new instrument that came with Live 12, and I think if you're thinking about, always when if you upgrade it or you're thinking to upgrade, what are the benefits and what changes could that bring to your music, etc. What does Meld offer that the other synths in Ableton Live don't? That's the big question really here on the table, because if we look at the Ableton instrument folder, and we're talking about synths, we've got Wavetable, which is a fantastic synth. We've got Tension, we've got Operator, which is capable of quite a few different types of synthesis, additive, FM, and subtractive. We've got Electric, and then we've got our familiar characters as well, like Analog, Collision, and Drift. So Meld is new. It's joined up with that team of fantastic synths. And I like to think of synths a bit like guitars, having a collection, for example, of guitars. What do they all bring differently when you play them? Will sort of timbre and tone and character, right? So Meld, if we have a quick look around at it, it's a 2-oscillator synth. So we've got over here on the left-hand side, oscillator A and oscillator B. And they have corresponding sections, engine sections to the right, envelope sections in the middle here, filters, a mix panel, and then you've got the global panel on the far right hand side. If we look at the oscillators themselves, there's already a lot of different oscillator types here, which means new engines that generate tones for us. So there's quite a lot of new different oscillator options inside of here. And as I said, we've got 2 by default, so we can layer those 2 up. What I think sets Meld apart is, okay, there's a lot of different engines here and oscillators, but what sets it quite apart is when we come over to the far right hand side here, we've got this thing called stack. And if we just see it over here on the right, it's currently off, but we can choose 2 or 3. And I'm going to dig into that so we can kind of have a listen to what stack, let's say, brings to the table. So let's say we come up with a little bit of a melody or some sort of musical idea on the Meld, then we can kind of like go from there. So okay, well, let's maybe have some drums for a bit of inspiration. Okay, so that would be quite a sustained sort of melody sound, but let's just use capture for that and drop it into our track here. So we've captured the MIDI over here, and let's have a look. If we need to do any sort of quantization or anything like that, I think it's pretty good already to loop up as a 8-bar loop, so we can loop that up. We don't need that record active anymore, so we want to just do a global stop for that. All right, okay, hang on a second. There we go. A few technical issues today, happens sometimes. Okay, so I'm okay with the changes of where those notes happen, and it's just a single note, and it's in the scale of, let's say, A minor at this point in time. And let's have some drums for a little bit of reference on the sides here. just bring the volume down a little bit on meld, also on the drums. Okay, so if we're looking at meld, at the moment we've got these two oscillators playing at the same time, and it doesn't sound like anything particularly amazing, as it's super basic. We've done nothing to the synth so far. If we turn off oscillator B, which we can do here, we're just down to oscillator A on its own. And if we put in B, we get sort of a bit of an increase in volume, but not a lot else at this point in time. We're just layering two oscillators. So for every note that plays, we're getting two oscillators worth of audio output from this meld. But if we go over to this stacking that I was talking about, essentially what's really quite clever about that is that it's actually duplicating for every note all of the settings of these two oscillators, right? So everything that we do in a moment to A and everything we do to B, envelopes, filters, the oscillator we choose, etc., we're able to copy that again. So if we listen to it just at the moment as it stands, and we use the stack, should hear it probably increased again a little bit in amplitude. So if we look over here at our meters, we've got 16.2. What are we hitting? About -11 up the top here. If we take the stacks off and we reset that, you can see we're much lower. So we're building volume, so you can tell that per note we're getting an increase in amplitude, in volume. And if we go to 3, then we're doing a triplicate of each of these oscillators every time a note plays. You can see again our amplitude's rising a bit, right? So what's interesting about that is that obviously there's a caveat to this kind of stacking the oscillators, and that is that's going to drag up more CPU. So I've actually turned on the meters on each track here, and you do that, by the way, in 12 in this bottom right corner. Pop down to the very bottom right corner of Ableton, open up this little menu, and you can see performance impact ticked. That will show this little panel at the bottom here for the CPU. And if we stack 3, once this gets going a bit, we'll start to see that it will generate more CPU than it does if we turn those stacks off, right? So if we turn them off, meld will be a more economical synth. All right, so let's now start to make it sound a little bit interesting. So my point is, with the stack, that makes meld already something quite interesting, because it's the other Ableton synths aren't able to do that. They might have 2 oscillators, they might have more than 2 oscillators, but they're not really able to duplicate, say, everything that we've done to oscillator A twice, and then actually 3 times, and then we can also do that with B, right? So that's actually pretty powerful. So let's try and work on examples where we can hear that a little bit. So that's the first thing with meld that I think separates it apart in your toolbox. If we click this little circle over by the name here, we can bring up this beautiful view, expanded view, and this is the other part that sets meld apart from its other neighbors in the Ableton Live instruments. It's got an incredibly deep modulation possibilities, which again means, you know, modulation is kind of like where we can take one-dimensional music and turn it into 3-dimensional music. So this is super powerful, what's possible in here, cross-modulation, all sorts of different things going on, and we have this lovely matrix to sort it all out. So if we look, for starters, just at the oscillator A of meld, in its default, we've got almost like a wavetable synth patch here. So it says basic shapes, and you can see, just like if we load up Wavetable, right? So if we were to put Wavetable next door, we should see that, you know, when we load up Wavetable, we get the same default here of the different basic shapes in the very first Wavetable available to us. So meld kind of sets up in the same way. It sets up with the default oscillator showing those default wave types. So if we push play with just oscillator A and we move the shape knob right next door, we'll go from sine to triangle to saw, eventually all the way round to square wave. So if we're looking for a saw somewhere here, And then the knob next door, called Tone, is going to bring in a bit of variation to that. And they're going to be really interesting when we dig into a little bit of modulation, because both those are targets for sure, getting a bit of movement on them and modulation to make them interesting. So we can kind of sweep through, a little bit like Wavetable with this shape knob, and change the different shapes that we're playing back with this basic shapes oscillator. You can see here we've got these left and right arrows as well, so we can kind of skip through the different oscillators using this, okay? Or you can sort of obviously click at the box at the top here and go down and find a favorite oscillator potentially that way. Another thing we've got here that is unique to Meld is any of the oscillators that have the little insignia on the right. That means that they can be synced to the global scale that we're working in. So they are able to be note synced effectively to a pitch that we're working in. So if we have this active up the top here, we are saying that we're currently in the scale of C major and we chose that particular scale, then we can make sure, we can first of all make the device over here, you can see on the right, sync to C major, but also this oscillator itself can have a specific tuning. It will tune into the scale tuning we're currently working in. So that's interesting. So any of those that have that, you can see, are able to be tuned to the scale you're working in, holding on to that tuning. So if you look at one thing, the next thing here is as we go through the different wave shapes, you'll notice that these two parameters or knobs will start changing depending on which we choose, the naming and the structure of them. So as we go down, we're now in noise and it says shape and rough, square sync, frequency 1, frequency 2. So they're all relative to whichever oscillator you're working with in the middle here, right? And so that's fairly important to understand that to start with. And then if we move to the right of the oscillator engine, well, just before we do that, we've also got a fairly common thing that you should always find on oscillators, the ability to tune that oscillator, right? So we could have all these notes playing here, but we could tune this particular oscillator to a 7 semitones higher to play the 5th. And then you can also do some detuning here a bit, where you detune the oscillator a little bit in Synth. So if we put B on, we get this nice detune kind of sound happening between the two. Right, so it makes quite a difference. If you should often, I think, add a little bit of detuning to your oscillator. So the little bit here, tuned apart, we get that lovely character that's just come in there. Right? So just with that and some basic shapes, there's lots and lots of tones and different sounds we can get just from working with those parameters, right? And we're virtually doing nothing at this point, but just tuning the two oscillators apart a little bit from each other. And if we stack the second oscillator, B, at 7 semitones or 5 below, we're starting to get like a chord. Or the other direction. So that's fairly standard sort of stuff, apart from the fact that we've got all these different oscillators, engines here, and that the shape and the tone knobs correspond to each of those engines. The rest of the tuning, etc., is fairly straightforward. These are great targets to modulate, so LFOs, envelopes, they can become something really, really interesting. So if we move over to the right in the middle here, if we turn off again A, sorry, B, and we just concentrate on oscillator A for a moment. These are the envelopes that belong to it. So straight away on the left here, we've got the amp envelope for oscillator A, and then we've got a modulation envelope to the right of it, which is there so that we can actually map that to whatever we would like to map it to. So that's a free oscillator, let's say. And then we've got for oscillator A, its amp envelope, a free envelope, three LFOs actually. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then we can head straight to the matrix just for A and do our mappings in here. Then we've got MIDI and MPE. And again, separate for A to B, if we come down to B, we've then got the whole same sections again. So, you know, for me, that's quite boggling in terms of what are the possibilities. They're actually quite huge. If we then navigate from the envelope section to the right, we've then got the filter section. And again, we've got new filters in here. We've got these first two filters at the top. And then we've got some usual candidates: low pass, high pass, band pass, low pass crunch, that's different, low pass switched resonance. The filter, obviously that sounds super interesting to me. EQ, peak, notch, phaser, redux, valve, comb plus, comb minus, plate resonator. So again, massive amounts of filtering options that we haven't got in any other device. That level of filter possibilities. And again, we've got two separate filters for each oscillator. Over here we've got the mix page for each oscillator, so we can bring the levels of each oscillator into the balance. So for example, we could have this and say, okay, well, we just want that much of the B. Okay, so little things like that, fairly straightforward. And then finally on the right, we've got a few interesting things as well. We've got a little bit of spread, so we can get a little bit of kind of stereo spread out of the device. Let's actually just check what that's doing with a isotope imager. Let's throw that behind here. Have a bit of a look. So yeah, you can see we can add a little bit of width via the spread knob, which is quite nice. And then below it, we've already looked at the stack. So let's say we add the stacking, add a bit of spread. Let's turn the stacking off now just to listen to the difference. Quite a lot, right? So now you start to hear with the two oscillators and what I've done so far, what the stacking does. Right, and look at the stereo image. So we're adding, as I said, a copy of whatever's going on in an A and whatever's going on in B. We've got those two, and then we've got a duplicate of each of those. Just looking in the chat here, could you put your own wave as an oscillator? How you doing Wavetable? No. Maybe that's something they'll bring in the future. So that's just answering a question from Chavi Diaz in the chat there. Maybe they'll do something like that in the future where you can have your own custom oscillators, but at this point, no. But you could. So here's a solution for you there. Something to think about. You could always group up meld, switch off one of the oscillators, turn it into an instrument rack like I've done by grouping it, and then go and grab yourself Wavetable, pop it down here and add your own custom oscillator to Wavetable, and then layer that with meld. So that's how I would go about that if I was looking to do that, and you'll probably get some nice results doing that. But to answer your question, not currently. Maybe we'll see that in the future. Wouldn't surprise me. All right, so stacking, I think, really shows itself there. That's sounding really good. Finally, we've got drive at the bottom, just below stacking, and that adds some sort of saturation, some grit within meld itself. Right, and so far there's no modulation or anything fancy. We've just got two oscillators layered together in the basic shape. So we're going to obviously develop this sound quite a bit. Let's also grab ourselves, while we're in here, an oscilloscope. It could be always nice to see what's kind of happening when we do some of these things as well. So let's have a check. It's not that one, as that's not working anymore. That one, okay. Choice paralysis. too many things sometimes, trying to find them can, you as a teacher and someone who coaches people, try to limit your options so you don't have too many things and you don't have to go hunting too far. Anyway, let's have a look at what drive does here. So as you can see, this is the harmonics of the two oscillators. You can get quite a nice character in there, and it's giving us a loop. It's not so obvious here, but let's say then we turn off one oscillator, make it the sine wave. You can see we're getting some distortion of the waveform, right, with the drive. So that's what it's doing in the background, and this is just a pure sine wave at the moment. So as soon as we kind of step away from that, then we get more energy out of the drive. So I like that feature. We can always process it ourselves, but it's nice to have that kind of grit in there. All right, so let's say we maybe do a couple of things with this MIDI clip here so we don't get stuck on this sustained melody all day. Let's give ourselves another version here, and let's maybe use some of Ableton 12's tools down here. Let's arpeggiate this, and let's maybe say up. And let's say the distance of that, or the steps, we'll just have one. That's a little bit, so I'm going to undo that because I didn't realize it was a 30-second note. So let's go backwards, not that far back, but we'll do it again. Okay, so let's turn transform off, and let's turn this into something like 16th notes. I think is a little bit more what I had in mind. Okay, let's try that again. Command A to select all the notes, and now there we go. And let's also, when we undo that, let's go for something a little bit more interesting in here so we get something a bit more interesting. Alright, so we've got a couple of melodies to play around with now, rather than just the sustained. Let's also just make sure that's in scale. So let's actually fit to scale. Right, so that's the advantage of having this option over here, where we can, as you can see, hear the difference. That's horribly out of tune, but we're able to get ourselves into tune here by getting it into scale. Okay, back to the sustain. So now let's dive a little bit deeper and let's go through some of these oscillator types here and check out what we've got here. So let's say we turn off B for a moment so we can hear what happens when we skip through some of these in the A. So we've got this dual basic shape. That's quite nice. Really nice sub oscillator that we can layer under something later. And then we start to get some really weird ones. This swarm sine, I think, sounds really nice because it already sounds quite special and like there's a lot more going on than just a single oscillator, right? Same with the swarm triangle, swarm saw, swarm square. Then we've got some FM oscillators as well, which is really nice. Squelch. simple FM chip tune if you're into that sound. A shepherd's tone if you're into that. That's obviously a weird one. We'd have to find an interesting application for that. This tarp one I really quite like already. Used it a few times because it's got this really interesting character to it. Extra tone. Looping noise, filtered noise. I mean, that bit grunge, that's got nasty bass written all over it. That sounds amazing, just like it is. And then right at the bottom here, you've got some super ones for layering in some really interesting tones like this crackle. So you might ask yourself why, but it's this ability to kind of now create like really interesting synth tones that sound like they're many synths perhaps all together, but we're just doing it all in the one device, the meld. How fast the rain falls. Super interesting. So I'll try and give you some examples of how all of this sounds. But obviously there's a lot to go through, so we're probably not going to go through all of these oscillators, or we'd be here a lot longer than a couple of hours today. But very interesting. So let's come back to the basic shapes. Let's get our sawtooth. And on the amp envelope, it's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to do a synthesis lesson today, but you know, hopefully a lot of you that are tuned in and watching the live stream, either live with me today or on replay, you kind of understand your way around an amp envelope. So if we slow the attack down on these sustained notes, we can extend the release so the notes blend into each other each time they restart. So we get that nice sound now, just with one oscillator. And if we take off the drive, you can hear that's a really nice touch. Also the stacking. It's less dramatic with just the single oscillator, but it will make a big difference when we have the B involved as well, and then the filter. Let's try out some of the other filters. So steeper filter, the same. Low pass should be, this is modeled on the Korg MS-20, the MS2. So that sounds nice. High pass the other direction. Let's try out some of these other ones, the crunch, low pass crunch. So yeah, I think in terms of what it brings to the table, like I said, there are some big differences in terms of oscillators, filter types, and this concept of stacking, and then the modulation matrix, which we're going to get stuck into in a moment. Let's try the filter. Yeah, so filter has the drive, I believe. So if we look at some of these filter types, again, they have variations like the oscillators. They're specific to that particular filter. So the filter has drive down here. The MS-20s probably drive. Yep, also. Lovely. So a little bit like the amp envelope, which I was playing with here, the spare envelope, which is sitting in the middle here. Perhaps if you're new to modulation and using envelopes to modulate things, you could start by using that and mapping it to the filter frequency, this knob that I'm moving just with my mouse. Some of these parameters here could be very interesting, the shape and tone, as well as if you wanted, say, panning or volume, you could click on those and also use an envelope. So I'm going to show you a couple of modulation ideas here, but yeah, a free envelope that can be mapped essentially to pretty much anything, whatever shows up in the matrix side of it. So if you look at the envelope here, the mod envelope, which is here, for oscillator A, it can do any of those, that list of things scrolling up and down. It could be applied to all those things. So as I said, if you're new to modulation, you might want to start with some simple applications where you try it on the filter frequency, which is the line that's highlighted, the last thing I clicked. You could also try these, as I said, super interesting for sure. And as I said, you could also go to, say, the panning down the bottom there, and also the volume. They would be some basic parameters. And then if you look at the LFOs, it's kind of the same concept. What is the difference between modulating with an envelope and an LFO? Good question for the audience. There are some of you listening here in the live stream, if anyone wants to have a go at answering that and popping it in the chat, that'd be cool to see. What is the difference between modulating something with an envelope versus modulating it with an LFO? I'll leave it for a moment, so if anyone's there who want to answer it, and then I'll let you know the answer to that. So I'm going to pop the matrix back down. But as you can see here, again, we've got more LFOs rather than less. We've got LFO1, LFO FX, and LFO2. So the first thing I'll explain to you is that LFO1 FX modulates LFO1. Right, that's the idea behind the LFO1 FX. Modulate the modulator. So again, we're getting advanced there, but it's a great thing to do when you start to take your sound design to other levels, is going to make the modulator, so the first LFO you choose, modulate with another LFO. So we can do that. That's what LFO1 FX is designed for, and LFO2 is another spare LFO. A lot more basic, just has the basic kind of different waveforms and basically note synced or in frequency. Someone had an answer here, one versus a loop. No, that wouldn't be, I mean, not to say that's wrong, but answering the question. So what is the difference between modulating with something source with an envelope versus an LFO? An envelope triggers every time the note starts. So the same as the amp envelope works, every time a note happens in this case, melody, at the start of those notes, the triggering of the notes, the modulation, in this case, envelope works the same as the amp envelope. And it obviously has all the same shaping characteristics as attack, decay, sustain, release. So you could make it modulate coming in slowly, like I've done with the amp envelope, or at the moment, the modulation happens fast as soon as the notes trigger. So always try and remember, modulating with envelopes are connected to notes you're playing on your keyboard or notes in the MIDI clip. The start of those notes, the triggering of those notes triggers the envelope. LFOs are not like that at all. LFOs are like us having extra pairs of hands to move things around, but they keep cycling, so they don't pay attention to the start of each note. They're in a cycle, and that is this cycle of this sine wave or a square wave or a triangle. Whatever that cycle is, that just keeps cycling until there either is no LFO or there's more LFO. It keeps on cycling, right? It doesn't rely on the triggering of each note. So good to know. You can also find that in, for example, this LFO down the bottom here, there's a little R in the corner here in this little blue box. If we do uncheck that box, that is about the LFO. Let me rephrase that actually. The LFO currently does trigger each time a note starts, and it triggers in this same pattern as it looks like at the moment, if that box is on. So R means re-trigger. It means the LFO will keep re-triggering in its current shape from the same starting point, which is here at the beginning of this cycle. But if we turn this off, it could trigger from anywhere in the cycle, right? That's the difference between re-trigger and re-triggering being off. If re-trigger's off, the synth behaves, the LFO behaves like a old school analog synth where it doesn't re-trigger always in the same position. This is the LFO, right? And you sometimes find that with oscillators. You might find a re-trigger somewhere. It's going to be, if re-trigger is off, it won't start from the same position every time. So let's say that's enough, perhaps technical information there, but hopefully just the main difference between LFO and modulation. envelopes are the way they behave. Modulation envelopes are note triggered, and LFOs are a cyclical modulation source, not dependent on each individual note re-triggering it. So let's now have a look at some of what I've been speaking about. Let's use, for example, let's have a bit of modulation, and we'll start with, again, just the basic oscillator A, and let's try a little bit of envelope modulation of the shape and the tone. So let's say shape, and we go into the matrix, and we go to the line here, and we can go positive, which means it's kind of opening up the shape from the point that it is, and if we go negative with the envelope, it's closing down from that position, so it's going to the left of that position. So depending on where we are here, that's also going to sound different. Now the envelope is going to be quite subtle, so if we look at this as an envelope modulation of the shaping knob, and now we change that to the LFO, we're getting that cyclic wobble, right? Whereas the envelope is just very subtly opening and closing from wherever this point is, wherever we set the amount to. So currently the LFO is modulating either side of this amount, and the envelope is also modulating either side of that point, but a little bit more subtle. So if we open up the decay and the sustain, we can get that behavior to be a bit different, and we can go, as I said, negative. So it's now kind of you can hear every time the note happens. Right, it now sounds quite different because it's triggering this envelope, and if we adjust the envelope, it changes that behavior. So let's say I'm going to make a decision here with this patch that I've got going on at the moment. I'm going to reset my modulation envelope to its default position. So we're just going to double click in there and get it all back to default. I'm going to use the modulation envelope on the filter frequency because I think we'll hear that a lot better. So I'm going to select the modulation envelope to modulate our filter frequency. So over here. And let's say for the moment, we're going to open up from wherever I set the frequency. So let's say I set it to here. Could you modulate unipolar or just bipolar? You can actually often do both, but in this case, it's just bipolar. So, you know, as I said, I want to keep it kind of light so that it's not too technical today, because there's a lot more things we can do, such as looping envelopes and things like that. Let's not get too heavy on that and try and show you what meld does, but interesting question. We might revisit that another time, but that we would need a different synth to be able to select that option. Okay, so back to what I was thinking here, which is modulation envelope of this frequency here, and we're sort of opening it up, right? And let's say again so you can hear each time the note triggers, we've now got a bit of movement on this filter, and it's opening from this point, wherever I set it, it's opening up from there. So if I go the other way, minus here, I'm closing from that. So it's now closing the filter. Okay, and let's get an LFO onto the engines over here so we can kind of use that to get some interesting action over here a bit. And then let's have a look at the shape. So again, where are we? I think I'm happy to modulate around a saw that goes maybe into a square, or it could be a saw going into a triangle a bit. Let's increase the amount of that, and then let's go to the LFO page And let's maybe speed it up a little bit or slow it down. So we could say a faster. So at the moment, we're just only moving the filter, opening and closing the filter a little bit with our envelope. And we're now wobbling this shape a little bit with this cycling sine wave. And as you can see, if we turn off retrigger, it will sound a bit different, because it won't always trigger the LFO from that start point. It can be anywhere in this sine wave. Okay, let's say we now note sync the LFO. So we get, at the moment we're in frequency. Okay, let's try the tone as well, maybe with the same LFO or maybe with another LFO. Sounds nice. And what we can do now, like once we've sort of set up some basic modulation like we've got going on here, we could start like trying out different filter types here. The modulation stays there, and now we're able to cycle through, you know, different filters and try things out, see if there's something that we prefer. All right, so we could get pretty crazy here. Right, so let's bring that back to perhaps the low pass 12 MS20, which I think sounds really nice. And then if you look at the LFO section over here, we might come to that in a moment, but we've got all sorts of, like, again, different shapes. So we're just using a sine wave at the moment, but there's a lot of choices here. And we've got this bit of modulation happening. So in the same way we can try out different filters, let's now try out some different oscillators with the same modulation. Right? And we're still just working with one oscillator. So if we bring in B, thinking that all of this is possible with another oscillator, and don't forget, stacking is currently 2, so we're duplicating whatever's going on in A is already duplicated, and if we put B in, it's going to be duplicated. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And because we're only playing single notes here, I kind of did that on purpose. We don't have any chords happening. Let's tune oscillator 2, or B in this case, to another scale degree, so we get kind of this layer of almost like a chord. So let's say we modulate the filter on B, oscillator B now, so try and stay with me here as I start to move the modulation up a notch. So we're going to have a slow opening LFO on that filter. Let's try it down instead of scale degree up. And let's change from the sub oscillator to other types. Okay, now we're talking. So this is the thing, Meld is capable of a lot, because from my ears, if I was sending that to somebody to listen to and asking them, what do you think is that made of? How many parts, how many oscillators, patches, layers? Well, this is just 2 oscillators. Granted, they're stacked with some modulation and just basic modulation. I'm just picking on things that kind of are good places to start when you're learning. But as you can see, when you're looking at this matrix, you know, in terms of like getting more movement, more interest in your sounds, Meld can do the basics, by the way, very easily. You can just treat it like any of the other synths in the instrument, Ableton Live instruments. You can just do basic synthesis with it, with 2 oscillators, and that's it. But once we start modulating things and adding the stacking and these different types of oscillators and then modulating them, we get very, very interesting. Okay, that's super interesting. So you can hear the movement on oscillator B. It's lovely because it's going to giving this kind of like almost melody playing on top of the other. And we could do this patch a bit of justice here by adding something like, you know, the beautiful hybrid reverb over here. Let's also dial in our volumes of each synth. So I'm just using the filters to kind of set them in the balance, but we could also, you know, adjust here. And let's say this FM layer, I'd really like to modulate the panning of that. So I'm going to head into the matrix, and we can do it individually, as you can see in here, or you can open up here and look at the global one, and you'll find panning is right down at the bottom here. So I'm not going to use the envelope again. I'm going to use the LFO1 that I've got working here at the moment. Or yeah, that's what I'll do. So now we've got a little bit of left to right spread. And let's say we do step this up a very small notch, where we go from, you know, this modulation to some further modulation. Let's bring in LFO1 FX, which I spoke about a little bit before. Its main purpose here in the Meld is to modulate LFO1, right? So you can see here that we can add it to the same places, but we can also add it to LFO1. So we can, you know, click on something here, and then we can go into LFO1FX and modulate that part of the LFO right here. You can also use LFO2 if you wish, which is, as I said, a much more just basic LFO, but we've got 3. So let's see if I can find something here, well, that keeps it sort of simple-ish so we can still hear what's going on. And let's say we use LFO-FX to modulate we could start with the rate of LFO1. So you can now hit slowing down. Let's put it in hertz, it'll be a bit more wilder. And let's speed up the LFO2. Oh, we can scale it that way. Okay, now we're changing shape of it. Okay, let's go for a mount then. Let's maybe change our wave shape in the LFO1 to something else that we haven't tried yet. There we go. So yeah, modulating the modulator as it's known, we can kind of do some interesting things with that. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention to the chat for a little bit. Sorry, as I said before, Chavi, that I couldn't really answer the unipolar bipolar, but I think you're thinking of sort of some of the bitwig options there, knowing that you're also a bitwig user, and that's not something that is being applied in this case, let's say, that we're needing to flick between unipolar or bipolar. For what kind of sound has been thought melt for electronica or work with it? Well, like I said, it can do the conventional synthesis with 2 oscillators and sound great because you've got all these filters and drive and stacking, so it can do bass lines, it can do anything, but what it can do is like where I'm going now, drones and very interesting textures and sounds. So I wouldn't say it's genre specific, I would say it's more instrument specific. It's more about what sound are you aiming for in your current composition, and if you're aiming for something that's very modulated, 3-dimensional, interesting pads, drones, melodies like we're doing here, Meld has got a lot of qualities about it, so hope that helps, but definitely not genre specific. It's more a little bit like how do you fancy using it. I'll give an example a little bit of it just being used conventionally, if you like, so you can kind of hear it. But this is what Meld does really well: the modulation, the filtering, the movement, these kind of layered instruments like we've got going on here. So yeah, hopefully you can hear that's quite a complex sound out of still reasonably basic modulation and the parameters that I've chosen to modulate. So just to again just point out the stacking feature, let's listen to the difference. It's quite noticeable to me that the power Let's try out a few more oscillators here, some of the weirder ones. This is what Meld does, Chavi. It's got incredible possibilities of different engines, filters, modulation, so complex sounds, if that makes sense, but it doesn't have to be that complex, but it can make very interesting sounds. As I said, if you were perhaps not watching this and you're listening, you may think that that particular sound is made up of 2 or 3 instruments, whereas it's actually just one. So genre-wise, I think it's fantastic for electronica, yes, because a lot of electronica has this kind of depth to it. So let's take a conventional example of Meld alongside. So let's actually give ourselves another MIDI track. We'll get rid of Wavetable. We only had that there for an example earlier of the basic wave shapes. And let's say in this case, we do grab ourselves Meld and we pop it here. And let's say we kind of look at it in a conventional, more conventional sense, let's say. So, all right. Okay, just playing a little bit of a bass there. So let's say that we just check if we need any quantization here in this little clip I've played. So what I'll do is I'll actually just crop this area here that I've just played in, and we'll set about using it in a more conventional way. So let's pop down to our tools here and just see if we need a little quantization. I think it sounds quite nice actually, but okay. I'm actually going to go back on the quantization. And I'm going to leave it unquantized for now. All right, so let's try and make this meld in this case be a bit more of a conventional bass line, right? Where we're just going to use it like a standard 2 oscillator synth a bit. So we'll make the bass line have a saw wave and maybe a sine, or a triangle and a sine. Let's tune them apart a little bit. And let's adjust our envelopes a bit. So I'll do A first. And let's have the amp envelope of B being a little bit different. So it's a slightly slower attack. More sustain. So here we've got a fairly conventional sound going, so I hope that kind of helps see that it's not only okay. Let's add some drive to the bassline meld. Right, and it makes a nice meaty bass line there. So you can use it, as I said, in a very traditional sense for any genre of electronic music and beyond. But where it shines and excels is in all this beautiful modulation matrix, the options of LFOs, the envelopes, the filter types, the oscillator types. So if you were looking for drones and, as I said, layered sounds that sound very unique, Meld is definitely able to produce that in spades. So maybe what we'll do as one more example of Meld, and we'll dig into those some of those oscillators we haven't dug into yet. So let's give ourselves one more version of Meld over here, and maybe bring it to the left, and let's maybe try and play a few chords with it and see if we can come up with a little bit of a chord progression. Okay, I'll go back up an octave on my MIDI controller, it's a bit low. Okay, let's just say we turn that one off for a second. add that in the mix here. Let's actually maybe go for quantize this time round. They're pretty close to what I was looking for, but let's just crop that section that I've played there. Command A to select all the notes, and let's bring up our little bit of quantization just to get those start of the notes perhaps a little bit better. Last adjustment here a little bit. Okay, so now let's check out again some of these other oscillators here that we've got, where we looked a little bit earlier at all these unusual sounds such as rain and crackle and bubble at the bottom down here. So again, you can get this lovely little bit of texture, this layer sitting on top of your synth. And again, it takes sounds to another dimension where people would be at a total mystery as to, is that layered with actual rain or a crackle of paper being rolled up? You know, so you can build some really, really interesting sounds here. Heavy rain. I mean, I listen to that sub oscillator, for example, if you're still there, Chavidias, and I hear deep house. I can quite comfortably make a nice chord progression there with a really beautiful, like, deep synthy sound. Or church organs. So far, no modulation on this patch. All right, so that's a bit of a look at Meld and trying to show you the way around what sets it apart from the other instruments that we already have in our toolbox in Ableton Live. And so for those of you that don't have Ableton Live 12, apologies for that. I'm going to show plenty of things in the future in some of these sound design live streams that will be able to work across all the different versions. But I was kind of inspired today by question that I put out to the community of my YouTube community section, and Lauren, one of the subscribers and listeners here, asked if I could sort of go in a little bit and look at Meld and also the audio effect Raw. And both of those devices are very strong points for owning a copy of 12, and it's probably a good idea to look at them after this amount of time sort of working with them and figuring out what they do. So I think the first sound here that I sort of developed, the Meld, with the most modulation happening, it's pretty interesting, you know, and in a blind test, I'm going to guess most people will think it's as I said, more than one sound. Right, so Meld, all about learning about your modulation, what the different oscillators sound like, what the different filters sound like, etc. So use case scenarios, hopefully I covered that a little bit, and also good to hear that you found it sounds great, Chavidias. That's the main objective here. All right, so let's move over to Raw now and have a little bit of a look at that, so we can kind of bring these couple of tracks that I've got over here with Raw on them. Let's bring them over a little bit, if we can grab them together there. And what I've got here, we've been using the drum breaks just for a bit of character. We've got these couple of drum break tracks here. And by the way, they are both deliberately from Ableton Live's packs, so you should be able to, if you're again owning a suite version of Ableton Live, if you pop over to Places and Packs and you download yourself the pack that is the break selection, this one here by Sample Magic. Sorry, I'm on the wrong one. That helps when you're on the right one. Where did it go to? Beat selection, perhaps, is it? Break, sorry, it's directly below. So it's from there and it's into the sample folder, and then you've got all these vintage breaks here, and maybe it was sample folder 4. But yeah, it's essentially coming from inside of here. So, you know, there's lots of drum breaks here. There it is. So it's a DRM 100 Feed the Pony. It comes from this area here, and then the other one is from one of these other folders, or in fact, I think the same folder. So Scooper, this one here. So as long as you've got Suite and you download yourself the pack that's Break Selection by Sample Magic, you can access these drum breaks as well, and they sound pretty dope from my side of things. So we've got this plus this. So if we look at Raw brings to the table this kind of saturation distortion device that we had previously in Ableton Live in the audio effects. We had a saturator down here. Right, we have this device. We also have the drum bus, which is quite capable of adding sort of character and grit. There's quite a lot of effects here that can kind of do some things that we use Raw for. Probably the closest is the saturator as the device that would be the closest, but Raw kind of covers the saturator plus some of the other devices all together. Also the tube plugin, wherever that is lying in here as well. So let me just type that up here. Dynamic tube. So, you know, it's kind of an amalgamation of a lot of those devices in one. And if you're thinking third-party devices, maybe some of you own some of these kind of plugins. Well, one that I think stacks up pretty close, Raw stacks up pretty close to, would be FabFilter Saturn, which I think is a great device. So what you're talking about is having something that does what FabFilter Saturn does, but it's built in with Live. So as long as you own Ableton Live and you upgrade to 12, you've now don't necessarily need to have any more FabFilter Saturn. As this sounds great, FabFilter Saturn that is, and it gave us lots of modulation possibilities. Well, now we have that with Raw. So it's not going to be a look at Saturn, we're going to be looking at Raw down here. All right, so if we switch it on, and we're going to have it on top of this drum breaks, we can start with like changing the character of this drum breaks. And what I would also say is that when you use a device like the Raw, it relies a lot on the input that you feed into the device. So it's input dependent. So therefore it's what's called a non-linear effect. You have to really pay attention to the input side of things. It relies on that to do its work. And you notice by the drive knob, there's this very tiny little LED next door to it. And as long as that's flicking yellow, it means that this device is getting the drive it needs. And if it was sort of essentially, you know, not getting any drive at all, then we wouldn't really be getting any kind of saturation going on in there. So you can see it's already receiving more than enough drive. So if it's not, we can boost the drive here, and if we boost it, you can probably hear that we're going to start getting already some grit and lots of distortion and character from overdriving the input. Next door we've got this tone knob, and if we sweep that around, you might notice it boosts the high frequencies and does attenuation of the lows. So it's kind of filtering away the lows, boosting the highs. And if we go the other direction, we do the opposite, which is boost the lows and attenuate the highs. And there's some more adjustability of that in here where the middle point of the frequency is, and you can also flip kind of the behavior of this, but going to keep it not too, you know, I'll keep it to the basics for now. So drive is the input side of things. We're currently routed in a singular workflow. That means that Raw is just one stage of everything you see here. So whatever's passing through it is going through a single routing. We've got a bunch of fantastic options here where we can do serial. So stage 1 is then affected by stage 2. We can also do parallel, so one is above the other. That's going to sound different, so they both go out at the same time, but with different settings. Multi-band's amazing, so we can apply it just to individual bands of the frequency, aka Saturn. That's one of the things Saturn did really well from FabFilter. And then you can do mid-side focus and feedback. So you can have the normal sort of singular workflow and a feedback loop on top of it. It's output fed back in. Incredibly powerful, same as meld. These two devices are kind of lifers, is the way I describe them. You're going to find that they're going to be like a gift that keeps on giving. You're not going to know everything about it and be done with it in 5 minutes. It's just going to keep giving you more and more sound design possibilities as you learn it and as you try it out and understand it. So they are incredibly useful because, yeah, you're not going to run out of creativity ideas with them. So if we come to, let's put it back in singular mode, and we look at the next section here, we've got the stage 1 section of Raw. We've got the amount of the saturation that's going to happen down here. We've got the bias, which if we dial in a bit of amount, you can see this dotted line here, and we can kind of shift where that is on the saturation curve. So depending on which type of shaper we've got here, the bias could be sitting in its default position in the middle, or it could be a little bit to the left. That's all going to sound different, and it could be modulated to move around, so it's not static. Shaper, we've got again a level amount, so we can increase the shaper level down here as well, and then we've got like all the different types of saturation curves in here, which again we've got all sorts of really interesting options. We'll go through a few of them in a moment. And again, I'm starting to find, since I've been using this now, ones that I really like. This one sounds great on low end, this one sounds good on top end stuff, etc. Then we've got a frequency section over here, a filter, sorry, that we can add. And again, we've got a few different filter types, some of the usual candidates, and again, some nice new ones that do really interesting things. We've got a comb filter here, which can, you know, create some sort of fairly wild sort of sounds, and we've got this resampling one which is really wild. It's kind of a bit like having Redux, one of Ableton's effects, in the filter itself. So crazy stuff there. And I will point out the pre here, it's off by default. If you switch that on, that actually means then this filter section is working before the saturation. So if you want to filter the sound without really, right now there's nothing really dialed in here, I'm kind of filtering the input before the saturation. But if pre-switched on, I'm filtering after the saturation, right? So that's the difference there, which is good to know, I think. Then we've got a modulation matrix, 2 LFOs, an envelope shaper, which is quite mad. So whatever the input is that's being fed through this can be a source of modulation. And then we've got noise, some different noise waveforms that can also be modulating. Again, congrats Ableton Live for sound designers and people who want to come up with their own distinct, unique sounds, because this level of options, it might feel like choice paralysis, but step by step, as you grow into these devices, they can take you to weird and wonderful places. And like I said, find your own individual sounds. So the matrix can also be brought up, same as meld, to a fantastic display here where you can see all the different things that are going on. So if we change this to multi-band, you would see the different bands here. You know, incredible stuff, really well designed and thought out. So the matrix can be minimized or maximized. And then we've got over here probably one of the most favorite sections for me, this feedback side of the raw, where we can feed back the output back into the device itself and play around with it. And again, we've got a bunch of choices here. It could be in time that it's feedbacking, so it works like a delay. Can be synced, that feedback, triplets, dotted, and note down the bottom. It can come back and be repitched, which I've been playing around with and I think sounds really good. Then finally on the right, we've got a compressor, which means we can kind of in raw itself bring down the craziness if it's a little bit and sort of even it out. Sounds really nice, by the way. I've used it a lot to just add a little bit of compression and glue everything together and get all the peaks and everything sitting nicely. It's by default got this little box checked below it, which is sidechain high pass filter. So if you deactivate that, you're kind of, again, we're sort of not compressing we're controlling a bit of the low end with the compressor here with that on, and if we let that off, then we're sort of not having so much control over the frequency that we are with it switched on. And I think by default I'd leave it on to start with. So let's listen to this drum breaks and let's sort of hear conventionally a bit what we can do to it, and then let's look unconventionally. So right now, again, we're not really doing anything at all. We've got a drive, we've got input coming into here. So if we just look straight away at dialing into my mount, and let's open up the frequency, of the filter to its default. So if we're looking for distortion, that's pretty easy to do. And if we go down here through some of the different saturators, some are more noisy, some are more crunchy. Really interesting, that one. But this is kind of showing it to you in the conventional way. So again, a little bit like meld, what does this do that's special? Well, first of all of these routing choices, but let's again keep it simple for today. Let's just look at now again modulating things a bit, and let's look at this feedback side of things. So if before we modulate, let's take a listen and look at the feedback side of things. So we've got some action here, right? Quite a bit, which we can always tone down. We can bring the drive down, or we can bring the dry wet, by the way, over here, but just balance it in so that it's like a traditional saturation, that we want the output to kind of match what it sounded like without the device, right? Somewhere around there. So that's kind of what we're adding. We're adding all this character. But I'm going to put it back up so we can kind of really hear it, obviously, today. And now I'm going to add some feedback by cranking the amount knob here. Someone say a dirty melody from that drum break groove? Maybe. Let's have the filter frequency here modulate a bit. So let's go to the matrix and let's use an LFO for starters. This is where the bias knob gets really interesting because, as I said, you can move it around so it... And there's lots of different sounds in that in itself, so let's modulate that as well. And let's maybe use the same LFO, or we will change... Let's actually have LFO2 do the modulation of the bias, then we can have something different there. That's nice. So I need feedback, and we can kind of come back to something pretty conventional sounding again. So if we mess around with the feedback below, we can change like the time of the feedback in milliseconds. Like changing the delay. So this could create incredible range of FX sounds, etc. We could be recording the output of this. Down the bottom here, we've got this kind of little box that's switched on the feedback. If it's yellow like it is now, if we hit stop, or the note ends, this gates the sound, so it doesn't keep feedbacking forever. It will eventually die off like it has done over here. If that's off, the feedback will keep going, and it might be going till Christmas if you're not careful, and you also might want to put a limiter behind it if you get pretty wild with that, because it will just potentially keep building up volume as well. So let's pop that on, and next door we can flip the phase of the feedback, so it can be phased to the left or right, which could sound interesting. All right, let's try out some of the other ones. Synced feedback. So now we've got note sync up here. Let's try out something else here. Remember, this is a drum break, by the way. This is what it sounds like. Change our filter to one of these more wacky ones. Okay, let's go to a triplet delay or a dotted eighths. Anyone lost yet? Following along with this, hopefully. And then one of my kind of favorites at the bottom here in this feedback section, like I said, hopefully you can see why I think it's like possibly my favorite part of Raw, although there's a lot of other great stuff here, is the note. And now you can see we've got a frequency here. This sounds quite amazing for me. Okay, let's maybe try another kind of mod source over here to something like, instead of the LFOs, so let's have the filter frequency respond to noise. Then if we look at the noise types here, we can adjust that a little bit, right? So if we have sample and hold, it'll be really random here. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea again of like the possibilities of raw, and this is just using it on a drum break. So again, whatever source material we kind of feed through it, it's going to react a bit differently to that. So if I just set that back up again to kind of play through, and let's just remind ourselves what we're working with here. The source is this drum break. Let's feed it the other drum break. Let's bring in a meld from earlier, maybe. Things can get pretty crazy, right? Excuse me for going down a bit of a rabbit hole there with the sound design, but that's kind of the wildness that we can get with a bit of the raw. So let's now try it as a second example on something else. So I've got some different loops here. Again, they're from Ableton's packs. So as long as you're a Suite user, you can head into the packs and download these loops as well. So I've got something a bit more melodic this time round. So let's get stuck into it. Maybe have a look at the envelope so you can see what happens there as a modulation source. And if you adjust the attack, release, threshold, gain, etc., you can change what the envelope's doing. And that's now modulating the filter at the moment, the frequency. Let's try our other melody loop here, which is a piano. Sounds like this. Okay, let's go back in here for a second. So I hope you can appreciate that, Raw just sort of showcasing a little bit of what it can do here. It's a really, again, unique and powerful device that's native to Ableton Live, native to Ableton Live 12. We don't need essentially some of the third-party saturation plugins that we may used to have to buy to kind of get these kind of results and sounds. I'm in love with the feedback section of it. As you can see again, generally when you're sound designing things, if you think about sort of something that's one-dimensional versus three-dimensional, generally that three-dimensional aspect is going to come from modulation and getting things to kind of move around and get them not static, so they're interesting, because a lot of these sounds, if we came back to them and we didn't invest in using some LFOs and envelopes and modulation, they'd be very, very static and not so interesting. Whereas here we've got kind of a real level of complexity going on in some of these sounds. Then it's hard to understand, how they came about the way they are. Okay, so I did sort of say at the beginning of the video, I try and sort of pop something in here that can also be relevant for those of you who are not necessarily working inside of Ableton Live 12. But thanks to Lauren, this is where I kind of deep dived a little bit in today's video and took us down the path of looking a bit more closely at what Meld can do and also Raw, and what separates them from the devices we already have and also devices that are out there on the market. So let's come to these drum breaks for a second. And I've seen on a few, let's say, below other people's videos, working in Ableton Live and on forums and places like that, people are often asking sort of like, you know, how can we sort of, well, let's say a specific question was being asked, like how can we remove some of the sounds of, let's say, a drum loop, for example? How can we, you know, potentially remove some of the sounds from a drum loop? So let's look at a couple of ideas there. So let's say we move this drum break over to a new audio track. And hopefully this one will be helpful for some of you that, you know, I think for me personally, I don't limit myself to too much on the source materials. So if I'm using audio, I'm using audio. If I'm using MIDI, if I'm using hardware, it's all fair game for making music from. So if you sometimes need to think a little bit about how you can reimagine a drum loop, in this case we've got this breakbeat loop that sounds like this. Let's just bring it down a bit in volume. So let's say straight away, one of the first things you can do to try and make this audio loop your own would be to shift in, to go into the waveform, into the clip view here, and would be to look at where the sample loops from. And typically it's always going to loop from the 1 unless you do something different to that. So right now, every time we trigger this drum loop, we're starting from the 1 here. But one of the first things you can try, and this applies again to any different kind of music, is to shift that timing. So if we move it to here, we're now starting on a different accent. We're starting from the hi-hat instead. So we change the complete timing. So let's give it some context. And let's move it somewhere else. We'll move it in real time. Some of these are not going to sound good, but at some point we'll find that could work, right? Starting from the 3rd beat instead of beat 1. So depending on the source material, of course, what's hidden in between doesn't necessarily work. Like you're hearing there, we get out of time. But depending on the source material, we might be able to really shift the timing. So if you'd like to see a bit more on that, I can definitely dig up some loops that we could really work on. Let's try a melodic one here where we try that a bit. So that's, for example, interesting on that timing of the 16th note there instead of the way it is playing from the 1. And if we want to change it to a different grid, we can change the grid side as well, and then we can move it in 8th notes or quarter notes instead of 16ths. So that's just a simple one that you can try out straight away in an attempt to sometimes reimagine a loop and make it your own. So let me maybe see if I can find a quick one that might be more interesting that we can really shuffle. So let's say, let me grab something from in here. Okay, this could be an interesting one. There's lots of possibilities in this one. It's going to work pretty much timing wise from any position in the 16th notes. And so we get a completely new pattern. Instead of it starting from the 1 here and playing through there, it's starting from here. So if we stop and we trigger the clip again, we begin from there. So it's a completely resynced pattern. So that's something you can try out straight away. the question that people were asking a lot in the forums was like how to, let's say, remove some of the sounds from some of these loops. So let's say if we're back on the first drum break and we're in Ableton and we're in this drum loop here, what we can do is look over here at the clip envelopes, and we can look at the beats and the preserved transients and this section here. And if we change the below preserved transients to this straight arrow here that points straight through, we can then come to this box next door that says 100, the value of 100% preservation of the transient. All these little gray markers is what's going to currently happen. Let's see what happens when we move the value of 100, and so we're not preserving that timing anymore. Currently the transient timing is preserved. We're going to start manipulating that. If you leave it like this, you notice there's no difference, right? So we need to change the way Ableton does its warp engine. And if we change it to this straight through arrow at the top here, so we can now kind of virtually gate the sound off, literally, to the point where it's preserving, all we're hearing are the transients, what's in between them. So if we were to zoom in, whatever's going on in between these, we're cutting almost all of it away. So actually on a drum breakbeat like this, I'll very often do exactly this and just dial it in to what I'm looking for. Rather than that much, I might just like something like that. Then I could repitch the sample. Right, so we're all reimagining this loop with a couple of things that are built in. Now, there's one thing that obviously often pops up is people are asking, like, can we automate this? Unfortunately, you can't. That is just something that doesn't exist. There was a Max for Live device at some point that did allow that to happen. But literally what you can do is just open up, you know, an audio track next door, and let's say we make sure that it's going to listen to this track, arm it, set it to in, and then we can actually disable that so we don't need to listen to what's going to happen. And now we can set this up, this track, to be recording, and then we can go in there and tweak this in real time and even move it around if you like, if you want something quite interesting. And then you can see probably over here that it's changing all of that as it's recording it's live, and then we can go back in a moment and pick our favorite section. So a couple of options there. You could either set it up as a fixed preservation amount, or you could do what I'm doing here, and then, as I said, you could come along here with this recorded section and pick your favorite part of that loop that we've just recorded, and that would become even more interesting in the sense that the preservation amount is being modulated in the sense, and I was just doing that, by the way, with a mouse. You could also do it with a MIDI controller. So one last thing, if we come back to here, the same breaks, let's just switch off that input channel. We don't need that anymore for a moment. And look at the breaks again, and let's say in this case we don't preserve by the transients. So if we open that box up there, we've got some other options. We can preserve instead by note divisions. So let's choose 16ths. Let's hear what that sounds like. So again, we get that kind of gated, choppy, kind of glitchy feel, but it's to the 16th grid notes as opposed to the preservation of the original transients of the loop. And if we change this to something else, like eighths, so some of those things can be really lovely on a musical loop. Let me try that on one of these musical loops. So I've got the piano and the bells over here. So we can do the same thing, doesn't have to be a drum loop. Let's try the transients first, although the transients are pretty much bang on the beat, so there won't be too much change other than thinning it out like that. Still sounds really nice, but let's say we do 16ths. Right, and then we repitch it perhaps. Right, so in terms of sort of grabbing a loop off the shelf and starting to make it your own, You know, you can do an awful lot just in this area, and we're only at the tip of the iceberg. Let's say we also use reverse down the bottom here. Okay, let's try that. Right, and you can do the same as what I was doing before. Obviously record this out. Could add some delay and reverb. And you've got yourself quite a nice, beautiful loop without too much effort. You've reimagined something that may have come from a sample pack. In this case, it's come from Ableton Suite Packs, and you're starting to take it somewhere new, which I think is great. So reimagining, recycling, repurposing loops. And again, as I said, for sound design, creative sound design in Ableton Live, we're on the tip of the surface here for resourcing, reusing this audio material. So perhaps the last one for today in the same discussion, back with our original breakbeat here. Let's say we're going to come back to leaving this as it was, the pitch, the preserved transients. No need for any change. What we're going to do is the one that people, so we've used the preserved transients to, like I said, kind of almost gate the sound and select the hits that we want to select. But let's say we really want to cut out sounds and we don't want to hear them at all. Well, the way that I like to do that, and again, reimagine audio loops, is to pop into the envelope tab of this breakbeat here. And we want to see it down at the bottom here, and this is important. We don't want to see the mixer. We want to see the clip, which is what we're working on, and we want to see in here gain. And with the clip gain, we can then turn on our pencil tool, like so, and we can actually notch away whatever we don't want to hear, right? And so it just in its basics, let's say I want to take away this first hit. And you could zoom in to get it super accurate, so you can come right in here and make sure you only remove just what you want to remove. And also if you take the pencil tool off, you can start to click away some of these points or add points, for example, and you can then start to, let me try and get an example going here. Yeah, you can then start to make these so that they are curves and they're going to sound different, so you can shape it exactly to take away whatever you want to keep. And this is a great way to, again, reimagine complete drum loops. And also if you've got clashes in other tracks where this loop is playing and there are other loops in your project playing, this is a great way to remove any hits, let's say from this loop, that are clashing with another loop and we don't hear them. So if I don't hear this particular hit here in this percussion loop, I can cut the whole thing out. And that's actually helping the mix and helping my whole track sound a lot better by removing an unnecessary hit that isn't contributing anything. And in fact, it's actually bringing the track down because it's clashing with other parts of the track. Right, so at that point, I'm going to do a quick little recap, and then I'm going to say sayonara for today's live stream. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've found it beneficial, taken away some ideas from today's stream. And if you're a 12 user, started to imagine what you can do with Meld and Raw, which were the two devices that I really sort of mainly homed in on and deep dived on at the beginning today. So I kind of started where I started with this first meld here. Then Chavi Diaz, who was in the chat, mentioned, you know, could we use sort of meld for other genres other than electronic, because I was showing an example where it was quite complex sounding, let's say. Yes, we can use meld for conventional sounds. It does those as beautifully as it does really wild and interesting things. And then I've gone through using raw in a couple of examples with some audio loops where I've processed some drum breaks, the ones that you've been hearing, and also some melodic loops with raw and let it really run wild. So we've got this kind of meld synth that was the beginning today. And we've got this kind of simple sustain pattern. And we've got this one that's quite complex like that. Then I made it as an arpeggio as well. And then I played in some chords with the melds. And then I made a bass line. Well, actually it was the other way, it's a little bit the other order. The bass line came before the chords because I was explaining the conventional use of meld. So we've And then I went over to here and started to reimagine these drum breaks using raw. And some of these I've played around with a lot, so they're perhaps not sounding as they were in the beginning. But if you go back a little bit in the stream, you can kind of hear where I was just focusing in on the raw by itself. Yeah, so, you know, as I said, as a sound designer, as a person who uses Ableton Live, raw and meld, in my opinion, are incredible assets to the program. They're in the locker, in the toolbox. Both of them, as I said, for me are lifers. They're the sort of devices that are going to just keep giving more and more as you start to learn to use them and push them to their limits. And the limits for both of them are really, really far. So I will put a link at the end of this video somewhere here to the previous sound design video that I did, showing some tips and tricks with Ableton Live. And of course, I hope you can join me for the next Sunday's live stream. And if you found this video useful, of course, you know, consider subscribing to the channel. Feel free to give it a like, a thumbs up. Drop a comment, let me know if there's a suggestion, something else you'd like to see me work on, show in a different live stream. This live stream developed from that, the way it began today, and the focus of the devices. So on that note, I'm going to wish you all a great Sunday. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching back on replay potentially, and if you got this far, amazing stuff. Take care of yourselves, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will catch you in the next live stream. Bye for now. Cheerio. Take care.